Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm joined with my friend Classical Theist, and we're going to team up as papists to talk a bit about a nice papal encyclical by Pope St. John Paul II on the relation between faith and reason, entitled Fides et Ratio. This was an encyclical published in 1998, and it's one of the more well-known encyclicals, I think, in his papacy. So, Classical Theist, do you have any general thoughts about this encyclical? I think our plan for the discussion is just to go through section by section, but perhaps just to get started, do you have any thoughts on perhaps the historical context or the significance of this document?
Yeah, it's quite significant in the sense that uh, following Vatican II, the Church didn't really emphasize the role of philosophy and the use of reason to understand and to conceptualize, to categorize, to expound upon the truths of the faith. In a way that the Neo-Scholastic age did, in a way that Neo-Thomism did before the Second Vatican Council. That stuff kind of fell a little bit out of favor. And so John Paul II's encyclical here on faith and reason is kind of, in a way, a callback to that period in early 20th century church history, when there was really a renaissance in Thomism, and that you had the Neo-Scholastics, you had Etienne Gilson, you had Jacques Maritain, you had all these Catholic intellectuals flourishing, and after the Second Vatican Council, that kind of was de-emphasized, and I think it's a good thing that John Paul II at the time he wrote the encyclical, really tried to get people thinking about the relationship between faith and reason once again. In a way quite similar to Leo the 13th. When he wrote his encyclical Aeterni Patris on the restoration of Christian philosophy, he really ushered in a renaissance of Christian philosophy at that time. It's a bit unfortunate, though, that this encyclical didn't seem to usher in the same kind of renaissance that Leo the 13th did, but I think it was a good gesture.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Leo the 13th too, and it seems to be a general theme in the encyclical, say from maybe 1860 to 2000, because
Mm-hmm.
I think Aeterni Patris was 1879 approximately.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if you look after that too, with Pope Saint Pius X too, and Pascendi Domini Regis, that's one thing
Yeah.
I think he brings up too, is that there's a need within the church to revitalize some of this scholasticism as it was, or
Yeah.
revitalize it as a sort of neo-scholasticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
No,
that's
it's worthy pointing
certainly
out.
done by,
It's,
yeah.
it's worth pointing out John Paul II was definitely not a neo-scholastic, but um, uh, given that Thomism at that time, after the Second Vatican Council, really fell out of favor in the church, it's very refreshing to see a pope who was not of strictly that school um, try to, at the very least, bring not only St. Thomas, but that rigorous method of uh, bringing the truths of the faith before the light of reason, to bring that back into to the discussion. I think that was very, very, very important, even though the fruits of it are not as it didn't bear as much fruit as Leo the 13th did, unfortunately. But it's still very worthwhile encyclical to go through.
Yeah, and this general theme of the relation between faith and reason too, I think it's especially important nowadays.
Yeah,
Especially
exactly.
you and I were pretty savvy with the stuff that happens online,
Hmm.
and I mean, you and I have probably heard this over and over again, that what faith represents is just believing in any old stuff, just willy nilly, just you do as you're told, and
Yeah,
for no
exactly.
reason
I
at
mean
all. And this is
that's
going to be, yeah, this is going to be in
it's
contradiction to reason. So faith tells you one thing, which outright contradicts what reason tells us at a
yeah,
different
it's
level.
very unfortunate because I mean throughout the history of the Christian religion, that fideism, the idea that that faith and reason are really supposed to be uh, in conflict. They're supposed to be conflicting categorical realities. That was has traditionally and historically been a very minority position, Christian history. It's it baffles me that has become, even among both Christians and non-Christians, theists and atheists alike, very often, the sort of default position on the nature of faith, when that really could not be further from the truth.
Right. Yeah, I think we'll get into this perhaps in chapter 6 or 7 of this
Yeah,
encyclical. But JP2, he's quite explicit in saying that this
rejecting
fideism,
fideism. Yeah,
it's no good. It's rejected. And I think he echoes Vatican I in this sentiment. And also, too, with someone like, say, Pope Pius X.
yeah,
What faith also is not is like some sort of internal stirring of this, or it's not just that. It's not some sort of internal stirring of the sentiments, which I think he called immanentism.
yes,
So a lot of these kind of caricatures about what faith consists of, these are quite
yeah.
explicitly rejected in the encyclicals.
And it's worth noting that the Catholic Church has defined that. It has defined it is dogmatically defined against fideism. So I mean, if you want to be a Catholic, you can't be a fideist.
Yeah. All right. So how about we launch right into this encyclical? So I
Yeah,
think there are 9 parts of the encyclical. I think there's 7 chapters plus intro and conclusion. So let's perhaps we can begin with the introduction here. So the title of the introduction is, quote, "Know Yourself." And
hmm,
I guess the general impression I got from this introduction is that JP2 is echoing that all people have this calling or appetite for truth and of wisdom. That across the years, all philosophical systems are directed at not just this or that truth, but ultimately discovering truth as such, going all the way and discovering um, the ultimate grounds for truth. And he also mentions this is important for both logical and ethical consequences when he brings
yeah,
up right reason, or as we say in Thomistic thought, retoratio or orthos logos.
hmm,
So, so this seems to be a common theme across peoples. This isn't something unique to Christians, in that we have this common appetite for absolute truth.
right. And he as he lauds that, he really uh, juxtaposes that with the current kind of philosophical climate, which tends to use philosophy not as a scientia in order to attain the truth in itself, but really almost as a way to um, almost as a way to simply define uh, our simply as a means of doing epistemology, just strict epistemology, not as a way to getting at, being as being. I think he talks about that a little bit.
Yeah, the need to have an emphasis on the philosophy of being, not just say hermeneutics, like interpretation, or just reporting upon phenomena, things as they appear, but focusing on philosophy of being, like the way things really are. And I think to go back to what you're saying, that this juxtaposition with how we might think of truth nowadays, in paragraph 5, he says, sundered from that truth, namely like absolute truth and going all the way, individuals are at the mercy of caprice, and their state as person ends up being judged by pragmatic criteria based essentially upon experimental data and the mistaken belief that technology must dominate all. It has happened, therefore, that reason, rather than voicing the human orientation towards truth, has wilted under the weight of so much knowledge, and little by little has lost the capacity to lift its gaze to the heights, not daring to rise to the truth of being. So that's one interesting.
Yeah, and isn't that so true? I mean, it's today especially. I mean, you could just take the example of the YouTube intellectuals. Whenever they debate various issues, like such as, I don't know, gender ideology or whatever, they only focus on uh, experimental studies. It as if they're almost locked in them. They never try to venture into, say, the ontology of gender, just as an example, or the the philosophical anthropology of man. Uh, it's always you just get locked into these autistic merry-go-rounds, right? Of what does this study say? What does that study say? What does that say? And I'm not saying that's not important, but it does often seem to sidestep what's actually uh, the more certain points that can be accessed through a more philosophical and ontological reflection of these categories that are illumined by, experimental studies and experimental observation, but are not simply reducible to those means of understanding the truth. So I think what he said there is just very important in light of today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these guys, as you said, they lock themselves into, and it's a pretty narrow interpretation of what experience consists of too. I mean, these YouTube intellectuals, what they really desire is some sort of quantitative explication of nearly everything, even when the category under question isn't quantitative.
Yes.
And what they're really looking for is to read in an abstract of the paper, because usually they don't bother to read the actual paper. What they want to see in the abstract of the paper is some scientist telling them that, well, we've collected some data on here, distinguishing two categories, and one is it's statistically significant. That's a result that's communicated by science. This is the sort of thing that they're looking for.
Right.
But they never bother to ask anything beyond that. They never to venture into, as JP2 says, the truth of being.
Yes.
Or even interpret what those categories mean that
right.
they ask for quantitative measurements.
Right. I mean, because a lot of these experimental studies, they presuppose a lot of conceptual baggage that is not explored in and of themselves, which can be explored philosophically, but simply isn't, out of a prejudice against the discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one other point too here in paragraph 6. I think it's a nice quote too, and he's discussing the relation, this juxtaposition with the modern de-emphasis on the truth of being and going all the way to ultimate truth. He says, "For it is undeniable that this time of rapid and complex change can leave, especially the younger generation to whom the future belongs and on whom it depends, with a sense that they have no valid points of reference. The need for a foundation for personal and communal life becomes all the more pressing at a time when we are faced with a patent inadequacy of perspectives in which the ephemeral is affirmed as a value and the possibility of discovering the real meaning of life is cast into doubt. This is why many people stumble through life to the very edge of the abyss without knowing where they're going." So that's another nice quote there in paragraph 6. I think he's right that especially a lot of young people kind of vacillate between all these different systems of thought, often from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
A lot of us are especially kind of pretty lost.
Right. I mean, it should be pointed out, the philosophy, simply using reason to attain the truth. It's hard. It's difficult. It's complicated. And that seems to be, in some respect, a result of the loss of the role of faith. Faith helps us to, we use reason, to the best of our ability. We recognize that various truths that lead to the faith follow upon metaphysical analysis. But once we make that ascent of faith, that epistemically serves as kind of an anchor, so that we don't have to. We can simply trust the reliability of that investigation and not be lost into that perpetual that vacillation that I think would occur if you didn't, at that final moment, simply assent absolutely to what reason has moved you toward.
Yeah, especially in our times, it's a pretty common observation that you find people who spend, say, 2 weeks as a communist. My 2 weeks as a communist, and then after that they'll become a fascist, then they'll drift to some other ideology.
Yeah,
And
it's a
they'll become an
strange.
ANCAP. They'll
Yeah,
become an
it's a very
ANCAP, and then
strange
something
thing.
else.
It's like a fear of resting uh in what you see to be the truth.
Hmm. I mean, I'll certainly confess, I think I had my 1 week as a communist, but
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
I got over
I've had
that.
I had a week as a solipsist, so in my
Oh, 1 week.
yeah, yeah, I mean roughly, just short time, short period of time.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't see any sort of virtue in that thing. Too. I mean, I guess on the contrary, someone could say that, well, this is certainly a healthy thing. If you're really in the intellectual life and you're trying to explore everything, why not just vacillate from position to position? Why not just spend a
Yeah,
couple of
let's
days as
say
an ANCAP, and then a couple of days
it
as a libertarian, then let's become a
yeah,
fascist?
it touches on another thing that John Paul II says later on, where he says that that kind of uh, pride in vacillation, uh, it rests on the error of treating philosophy, or not philosophy, but the search for truth as an end in itself, as opposed to the truth being the end in itself. Um, uh,
Hmm.
One could say, of course, that this act of perpetual vacillation is simply a result of uh, coming upon new information that corrects error, previously held errors. But it just seems to me that that's not always the case. It seems to me that often one is uh, by default ready to give up um, their position, whatever position they come to hold, simply out of almost religious reverence for the very act of searching for the truth as an end in itself, as opposed to simply being content with resting in what most reasonably seems to be uh, uh, the the truth derived from real rational investigation, of course. And of course, that's not to say that one can't change their position based on new information that that comes along. But at the same time, one should be content to rest in the truth that one comes across, and not uh, put oneself in such a perpetually fragile epistemological situation simply out of uh, reverence for skepticism as the default position.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I was listening to a few days ago. I think it was a Father Chad Ripperger lecture. I'm not sure if anyone in our audience knows who that is, but certainly you know who that is.
Yeah.
I think he was pointing out that in St. Thomas's classifications on the virtues and on the vices, one vice is effeminacy, which
Mm.
doesn't mean what people often think it means. And one sort of effeminacy is intellectual effeminacy, and part of that
Yes.
is this going back and forth and not being content to rest in the truth once the intellect has grasped what the truth is. It's just going back and forth and constant doubting, and
Yeah.
as though the doubting is like an end in itself, like
Right.
that's a good thing of itself. So it's this is also what JP2 is talking about here. This could also be called a sort of
Yeah.
effeminacy.
It's not saying don't ever change your position, but it's saying uh, don't treat the the skeptical impulse as a given, as a default given. That, and in a sense, the skepticism itself becomes a sort of absolute in that regard,
Right.
ironically.
So yeah, I think that comments on the know yourself portion.
I think we covered um, enough of that.
Right. So chapter one, God's wisdom. I'm getting into the contrast
Uh,
and the harmony between faith and reason.
you cut out a little bit. Can you repeat a little bit of that?
So, chapter one is entitled "The Revelation of God's Wisdom," and in this section, we're starting to get into the relation between faith and reason. And he talks a bit about some of the doctrines affirmed by Vatican I, which say that the truths attained by faith and reason are not identical, but they're also not mutually exclusive, right? And faith, in the sense that we understand as Catholics, adds in mysteries which are revealed by God gratuitously, which cannot be discovered by natural reason alone. And this is paragraph 9, but I think that's a summary, I think, of what JP2 is getting at here in this.
Yeah, people often, confuse those categories quite a bit. They either think that um, faith is that there's no uh, congruous pathway from natural reason to faith, or they think that faith is simply the result of philosophical speculation, and that you're just accepting the conclusion of philosophical premises that can lead to the truths of the faith. Neither of those are quite true. I think Vatican I gives us a middle ground position between those that's quite satisfactory. And the reason is simply if God is, if the divine essence is infinite, uh, then there's no way in which a finite intellect can probe into the inner life of the divine essence. Uh, the finite intellect can come to know the existence of the divine essence from its effects, from the effects that is the created world and its contingency and its changeability and everything like that. But it uh, but from the standpoint of the finite creature, it cannot traverse that infinite gap so as to probe into the inner life of the divine by itself. And so that's why when the divine reveals its inner life, it has to be taken on faith. And that faith is simply the assent of the intellect to that revelation as being of God. And that act of assent, however, is not done dumbly. It's not done uh, as Saint Pius X would admonish. It's not done out of some, as we said earlier, some sentiment of emotion, but based on uh, credible, rational inclinations that would lead one to thinking that this divine revelation has legitimacy. Uh, Numerous examples of that could be doing your own historical research and coming to the conclusion that the person of Christ uh, claim or is who he claimed he was, and studying the historicity of the resurrection and coming to those positions. It could also be through miraculous experiences that one might have encountered. It could also be through philosophy, but again, that what you can arrive at through pure philosophy, while it cannot directly prove uh, the data of divine revelation, it can uh, show that the data of divine revelation is fitting and suitable given what you can already know by natural reason. I think an example of that would be the incarnation, and I have a video on my channel that goes into that. But you can see the difference, though. Uh, it's not proving the incarnation by rational necessity, but it is to say that given what we can know about God from reason, we can infer that the incarnation would be suitable and fitting. And so then we can look at history and to see, is this a claim that has credibility? And if it's a claim that has credibility, then we can give our assent of faith. And once we do that, we recognize that, well, that the data of that faith, since it's derived from a source that is the ground of truth itself, it cannot err. And so that's why the faith is unwavering. That's why the faith is uh, held uh, with certainty, given its source that has been seen as legitimate given other means of epistemic credibility. So I think that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, I forget which document this was in. I think it was maybe De Filius, but it was essentially saying what you were saying is that there's a harmony between what we as Catholics think we can know by the steam of our own reason, what we can work out on our own, and what is given to us. But at the same time, giving intellectual sense associated with faith is not some sort of stirring. It's not merely the stirring of some sort of internal sentiment, and it can be made credible by external signs, which I think is the language used in
Yes.
I think De Filius. I think it was actually pretty harshly condemned that if someone says that the faith cannot be made credible by external signs, that this is I think it was anathemized actually.
I think that was anathematized. Yes, it was. Um,
So you see
yeah,
that there's this balance here between
yeah,
what we think we can
is
know, I guess, rationalistically, just as a step by step working out within our own reason,
right. It's
and
similar
at
between
this, yeah,
it's similar with
good,
the distinction between nature and grace. Uh, when grace is infused within the soul, it's mediated through the human faculty of the soul. So it is the so while the soul is being moved by grace, by God's grace, uh, causally, the inclinations of the soul on part of the human creature are still uh, are still moved uh, through their own natural powers, yet elevated by grace. But that doesn't diminish the role of those natural inclinations. They still are inclining themselves toward grace naturally, even if caused by a supernatural agent. And so, similarly, when reason comes to give its assent to faith, it's still using its natural mode of being. Its natural mode of being is not canceled out simply by the act of faith, but it is elevated beyond that which it could arrive at simply by its natural powers. But its natural powers are not canceled out. It's still operative naturally all the way through, yet elevated beyond itself.
yeah. I was just looking up this document. Yeah, this is from Vatican I, and perhaps I could just read it because I think it's pretty relevant to what we're saying. On
Yeah,
the part labeled on faith, it says if anyone says that that divine revelation cannot be made credible by external science, and that therefore men and women ought to be moved moved to faith only by each one's internal experience or private inspiration, let him be anathema. So I mean, you can see here. I mean, the language is harsh, but again, we're trying to strike this balance between what we think we can get at on our own steam, but on the other hand, not thinking that we can prove it. But at the same time, not saying that it's just totally made up, but we can give credibility to the certain things
yeah.
that we assent to by faith.
It's the difference between provability and plausibility. I mean, reason can give plausibility to the truths of faith, as for example, the incarnation, as I discussed. But it can't give a strict proof of these things. Uh, Really, I think because of the principle of proportionate causality, right? I think cannot give that which it does not in some way possess. To use a scholastic maxim, I mean, reason itself, the finite intellect, does not of itself possess the capacity to know the infinite, and that's what it would require in order to get at a truth like the inner life of the inner Trinitarian life of God. Um, but at the same time, once the inner Trinitarian life of God is revealed to us, it's revealed to us in a way that is congruent with that which reason can know about God simply through its own natural mode of being. So there's this wonderful uh, uh, seamlessness, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, going back to what you're saying about the analogy being drawn between grace perfecting nature and faith perfecting reason, this is precisely the analogy that JP2 uses in paragraph
Hmm.
43. And just looking at my notes here, yeah, he was saying that as grace perfects nature, there's an analogous relationship between faith and reason, in that raises reason to truths that it cannot acquire on its own. And
Yes.
he's also says that he thinks Aquinas represents the right way to do theology and to preserve right relation between faith
Right.
and reason.
I mean, I would say St. Thomas had a perfectly congruent understanding of the role between grace and nature, so it's fitting that he would be the one to give the best account, the best congruent account between faith and reason.
Hmm. Yeah, so another point I think that was quite interesting in chapter one, too, was paragraph 13, where he talks about freedom and how it's related to giving the intellectual assent to faith. Because it may seem that when one gives intellectual assent by faith, that it somehow represents a denigration of one's freedom, or you're giving up something. And that's actually tied into the modern view of freedom. But we see in paragraph 13 that JP2E seems to be echoing an ancient conception of freedom, where freedom has more
Right.
to do with realizing your own internal nature, like directing your own internal nature toward the good. And just to read a
Yes.
quote here, he says, indeed, it is faith that allows individuals to give consummate expression to their own freedom. Put differently, freedom is not realized in decisions made against God. For how could it be an exercise of true freedom to refuse to be open to the very reality which enables our self realization? Men and women can accomplish no more important act in their lives than the act of faith. It is here that freedom reaches the certainty of truth and chooses to live in that truth. So that's, again, I think that echoes a more ancient conception of freedom, where it has to do with realizing one's internal nature and making sure that is directed toward the good, not so much a modern view of freedom where it's just, well, it's just let me do whatever I want. Don't hinder
Right.
me in the expression of my own individual will.
It's very interesting how opposed to one another the ancient view of freedom versus the modern view of freedom. Because according to the ancient view, that modern view idea of freedom is the opposite of freedom, because it's precisely uh, because in the ancient view, to be free is to go beyond the limitations of the irrational passions which weigh one down and keep one chained uh, as a prisoner of one's passions. Uh, that seems to be exactly what the modern view of freedom advocates. That simply to do whatever you want is precisely to be ruled by the appetites. It's interesting how polar opposites uh, they are. You know.
Right. Like if you take an example of a drug addiction, on the, I guess what Isaiah Berlin would call the negative freedom, or this is more analogous to the modern sense of freedom. Someone who's addicted to drugs, as long as he's able to, if he has the appetite for drugs and heroin, he's getting his heroin injected every day or however often his dose is, that exemplifies freedom. Whereas in the ancient conception, because you're in the throes of this vice, you're obviously
Yeah,
not in
that's
control of yourself.
precisely
You're
not to
not
be
directed
free.
toward the good. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. They're polar opposites. They really are.
Yeah, and seeing it because it's the season of Lent too. I mean, this
Right.
is why as Christians we're very concerned about. Well, that's one reason we're concerned with sin is that you introduce defects into yourself and trying to root out your defects. This is why we're so focused on this sort of thing, or one
Yeah.
reason why,
And
because becoming attached to certain things, drug addiction being one example, but
yeah.
let's say you're addicted to like pornography or you're gluttonous. Those are all attachments that you have, and you're not free if you're attached to those things. I think it was Augustine who
Yeah.
said that a man has as many masters as he has vices.
Yes. It's interesting how it's also quite interesting that the uh, in the ancient conception, the principle by which one would be free uh, is the reason, right? It's man's reason. Conforming yourself to reason is precisely to transcend the limitations of the passions that weigh reason down, and uh, that's that goes into really the nature of the intellect itself and why it's immaterial. The intellect is immaterial because it has a sort of transcendence over uh, material objects, so that it can survey uh, material reality sort of from a bird's eye view and direct the will toward an object of its choice. Um, but of its informed choice, of course, after having understood the nature of sense phenomena, uh, and that is, I think, directly opposed to uh, the more modern conception, which chains reason down to uh, the appetites and the passions. And so it's interesting that it's reason itself that is the principle by which one is made free, um, in the ancient conception and in the view that John Paul II is advocating.
Mhm. Yeah. So, do you have any more comments on chapter 1?
I don't think so. I think we're good to move.
Sure. Yeah. So, chapter 2 is entitled "Credo ut intelligam," which I think means that it's echoing a statement made by, again, Saint Augustine, that I believe in order that I may understand. I think that's the Latin translation of that. Um, so one thing I really liked about this chapter is he shows that how this view that we're trying to expound here, where faith and reason are harmonious, is contained even within Scripture too. Even I mean, if you demand a scriptural evidence of this, because he appeals to the Book of Wisdom, a few Psalms, and Proverbs too, and how we come to understand God through His creation, and that creation, the beauty of creation, testifies to the beauty of God and His power. I think that's an accurate summary of what he was saying in this chapter. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It really touches on like what you just said about uh, coming to know God through creation. Um, that I think touches very much on what we intend to do, with our channels, to really uh, show the means by which one can come to know rational truth about God through his created effects, through things like uh, causality, contingency, composition, um, these kinds of things. Uh,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A few of the books he's referring to within the Bible, the Book of Wisdom, particularly chapter 7. I mean, the whole book is a testament to this thought, I think. But also St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, 1:20, where St. Paul says, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his eternal power also and divinity, so that they are inexcusable." And he means that, I think the context here of this in the letter to the Romans, that he's referring to the pagans, right? That there's no excuse that there's somehow no reason for them to have any to not having sort of knowledge about God, because they can reason about God from created things.
Yeah.
So there's no
So
excuse.
I really don't understand why people are still uh, under the impression that the existence of God is a matter of faith. That's something that is explicitly denied by St. Paul, and yet it's affirmed by Christians and atheists alike, and that just baffles me.
Yeah, I think that was another thing that I mean, more modern, that Pius X condemns in one of his works, that if anyone says that the existence of God cannot be proved through the light of natural reason, then that's contrary to the Catholic faith too. But yeah, any other thoughts on this chapter?
I think chapter
I mean,
two
that
kind
seems to
of
be the
reiterates a
general
lot of
theme.
things that we've kind of touched on. Um, let's see.
Yeah, so chapter 3 is, I guess you would say, the converse, and it's titled "Intelligo ut credam," which I think translates as "I understand that I may believe," or "I think that so that I may believe." But Yeah, one thing I like about this chapter too is he cites our mutual friend Aristotle. And I think it's the first sentence of his Metaphysics that
Theist Aristotle.
first or second that yeah, all human beings desire to know, which is I guess echoing the theme of it in the introduction too, that it is just within our human nature that we have a desire to know the truth, and not just this or that truth, but to go all the way, as it were, to fully know truth in its totality.
Yeah, uh, just kind of skimming over a few things here.
Yeah, I think he says that. Yeah, like in paragraph 25, he also says that to seek truth and to stay in the truth once it is found is also a moral obligation, and that goes back to what we are saying before, that once one finds truth, one should rest in and not just vacillate back and forth between all these wild systems. Just to read a little bit of paragraph 25 here. Again, he quotes Aristotle's in Metaphysics. All human beings desire to know, and truth is the proper object of this desire. Everyday life shows how concerned each of us is to discover for ourselves, beyond mere opinions, how things really are. Within visible creation, man is the only creature who is not only capable of knowing, but who knows that he knows, and is therefore interested in the real truth of what he perceives. People cannot be genuinely indifferent to the question of whether what they know is true or not. If they discover that it is false, they reject it. But if they can establish its truth, they feel themselves rewarded. It is this that St. Augustine teaches when he writes, quote, I have met many who wanted to deceive, but none who wanted to be deceived. It is rarely claimed that persons have reached adulthood when they can distinguish independently between truth and falsehood, making up their own minds about the objective reality of things. This is what has driven so many inquiries, especially in the scientific field, which in recent centuries have produced important results, leading to genuine progress for all humanity. So, yeah. So, any other thoughts on that section?
Yeah, I think it's important what he says after that, where he says, no less important than research in the theoretical field is the practical field, by which I mean search for truth which looks to the good which is to be performed. In acting ethically, according to a free and rightly tuned will, the human person sets foot on the path to happiness and moves towards perfection. Here, too, is the question of truth. It is a conviction which is stressed in the encyclical letter Veritatis Splendor. There is no morality without freedom. Although each individual has a right to be respected in his own journey in the search for truth, there exists a prior moral obligation, and a grave one at that, to seek the truth and to adhere to it once it is known. Where and
Another interesting paragraph too. I think that further reemphasizes the congruity between, I guess you can say, natural reason, that which we perceive through, say, the empirical sciences, and that which we understand through theology. He says that this truth, quote, this truth which God, this is paragraph 34, by the way, this truth which God reveals to us in Jesus Christ is not opposed to the truths which philosophy perceives. On the contrary, the two modes of knowledge lead us to truth in all its fullness. The unity of truth is a fundamental premise of human reasoning, as the principle of non-contradiction makes clear. Revelation renders this unity certain, showing that the God of creation is also the God of salvation history. It is one and the same God who establishes and guarantees the intelligibility and reasonableness of the natural order of things, upon which scientists confidently depend, and who reveals himself as the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. This unity of truth, natural and revealed, is embodied in a living and personal way in Christ, as the Apostle reminds us. Truth is in Jesus. He is the eternal Word in whom all things were created, and he is the incarnate Word, or Logos, which in his entire person reveals the Father. So again, that's one statement I liked in the middle of that quote, that the same source of intelligibility is the same one that we Christians claim to be incarnated.
yeah, and it touches on, I think, who was it? The Jesuit Stanley Yaki's thesis, that that intimate congruity between the intellect and sense phenomenon is radically emphasized through the doctrine of the incarnation. Because in the incarnation, you have God, who is the primordial intellect, uh, uh, in whom and through whom all things are intelligible, um, unite absolutely with his creation, is particularly in man, so that confirms, it verifies, uh, the 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 strong congruency between the mind and its ability uh, to know, as St. Thomas would phrase it, the intelligible species, the uh, phenomenon insofar as it is intelligible. The incarnation, I think, stresses the fundamental compatibility between the human intellect uh, and truth.
Right. Yeah, I think that was. Did you have any other comments on that chapter? I think some of the latter chapters, I'm kind of getting through this because I think there are more important things for you and I, especially some historical notes on philosophy. And
Yeah.
so the next chapter, chapter 4, is entitled "The Relationship Between Faith and Reason." Let's see here. Yeah, this chapter is pretty interesting because he traces some of the history of how Christians seek to use philosophy, especially Greek philosophy, and how they've done so, especially among the early Christians and the church fathers. And one thing he points out too is that perhaps a not well-known fact is that in the book of Acts, we see St. Paul speaking to the Stoics and Epicureans,
Mhm.
which are two Greek philosophical schools. And St. Paul notices that the pagans were lapsing into idolatry, and they're essentially lapsing into superstition. And yeah, so he basically emphasizes the communication that Christians have always had with Greek philosophy.
Right. Yeah, that has gone on since the very beginning. Um, and it's worthy to note, as he mentions later on, that all the church fathers, they were very much active in constant disputation with their uh, pagan contemporaries. Um, and they I don't like using the word borrowed, but I suppose it can be appropriate here. They did in a sense borrow the language of, Platonic philosophy in order to incorporate it into understanding the truths of the Christian faith. Um, so this congruity between faith and reason has really been at the heart of 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 the patristic era. I think a lot of people try to say that uh, scholasticism, in its uh, triumphalist outlook on human reason, was in contradiction to uh, the patristic era. I say far from it. I think if you look at the church fathers, they were very much happy to use uh, these philosophical categories in order to get at, the nature of Christ, who is Christ, how can we understand uh, the nature of divine revelation through these rational categories. I think that has been something that's been at the heart of Christianity since its inception, and that's proved by particularly Origen, as he mentions in paragraph 39, how he adopts Platonic philosophy um, in order to combat some of the non-Christian naysayers. You know,
And I think, on the contrary, that JP2 he also points out that Christians don't uncritically accept what Greek philosophy says.
right?
For example, and
They
this is something
yeah,
a lot of people get confused about
they
with like
can't be
Thomism.
fully
That
baptized.
yeah, I mean, we certainly recognize that there are some things within Aristotelianism which are incompatible with Christianity, and but
Yeah,
like I said, people get this confused with Thomas, and they think that like a Thomist to be beholden to anything that Aristotle happened to have said or anything that Aristotle happened to have thought. And that's assuming too that Aristotle reasoned correctly from his own premises. So
right.
this is also pointed out in, say, paragraph 37. And a lot of church fathers, they were certainly aware of this too, that you can't just uncritically accept what comes out of Greek philosophy. And I think he quotes Tertullian.
Yeah,
Well,
Tertullian
yeah,
was definitely uh, suspicious of Platonism.
yeah. What was this quote?
Does he have that
What's
quote? Oh,
Athens?
what does Athens to do with Jerusalem?
Right. Yeah.
Uh, I think I think he went a bit too far with it, but at the same, but it is true, you know. Uh, and you know, you had Saint Athanasius, right? In his I think his work on the incarnation of the Word. Interestingly, he takes he goes to a lot of great pains to refute a lot of the non-Christian sort of Gnostic, uh, hyper Platonized metaphysical stances that kind of run into conflict with Orthodox Christianity. But he goes through them and he kind of refutes them on rational grounds. He doesn't just assert the points of the points of orthodoxy. He actually goes through and tries to argue against those conflicting positions on their own terms with reason. So that's another example of the reverence that early Christians have had for philosophy and the role of reason to understand the faith. I mean, I think it was uh, Saint Gregory of Nyssa who had the quote where he said Moses was you know Plato writing in Attic Greek. And I always thought that quote was amusing to me.
Hmm. There's one thing that's pointed out by not only JP2, but also I think by Augustine too. That I mean, certainly Saint Augustine was influenced very much by
Oh yes,
Neoplatonism, but
very much.
he wasn't a Platonist though. But he actually rebukes Platonism because he thinks that Platonists didn't really go far enough. They knew what they were looking for, which is the truth, but they deny this in the incarnation, the Word made flesh. Because I mean, Platonists are going to have all sorts of problems with that. So
Yeah,
it's not as though like if you're an Augustinian who's influenced by Plato, or I'll say a Thomas who's going to be pretty influenced by Aristotle, but also Plato too. Is that you're not beholden to everything that Plato and Aristotle said. I mean, in many ways, they didn't go far enough.
yeah.
And Christianity it's presents the correct completion of
Yeah,
what they're
and
aiming
you
at.
know, not only did they not go far enough, but Christianity helps to uh, mend uh, a lot of the difficulties that a lot of these ancient philosophers kind of ran into. You know, I think Plotinus, for as much as I admire Plotinus, when he tries to conceive of you know the one and you know the emanations of the one could clearly see that there's an awkwardness to it. You know, when you have the one, the news of the world soul, there's a rationally, it doesn't seem to click as well as one would read it in light of the Trinity. I think if you really critically examine the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Spirit, um, and and you compare it to Plotinus's conception of the one, the world, soul, and the new, I think you do come to realize, to recognize that the Trinity, I think, even as it brings up a lot of uh, mysterious conundrums, it does kind of satisfy uh, something that Platinian theology uh, wasn't quite apt to fully reconcile.
Right. Yeah, and just going back to this theme of what faith coming from Christianity does is it elevates what we can have by natural reason. And going back to what I was saying, that St. Augustine, I think this is in paragraph 40, that St. Augustine recognizes that the Platonists recognize what the goal is of their own steam and upon natural reason, but they reject what Christianity completes to it, what, in this analogy, what faith adds to it as a supra
Mm.
rational thing.
Yes.
So they recognize the goal of their own steam by natural reason, but there's something that could be added to it, and that's what Christianity provides to it. But it does not contradict it, but it elevates it to a level that it cannot attain on its own power. And
Yeah.
that goes back to the analogy that we're emphasizing over and over again, that just as grace perfects nature, faith perfects reason as well. And this is in
Right. And
paragraph 43 too.
it's you know a lot of the Platonists and Plotinus himself was very fascinated with the idea that goodness was self-diffusive. Um, it's a very for people who are unfamiliar with Platonic philosophy, that's a very common thing you find in Plotinus, that goodness is self-diffusive. It has a tendency to empty itself, and Plotinus saw goodness as essentially uh, synonymous with the one, with God. They saw goodness as the prime reality. They didn't focus on being as much as they did goodness. I think if you see if you look at Christianity, you really see that uh, as a completion, a fulfillment of what is found wanting in these systems. Because if you take the notion that goodness is self-diffusive, goodness is self-emptying, and then you look at the world, you can kind of see an incongruity there, that God empties his goodness uh, uh, almost naturally. Plotinus would say this is through the emanations, but with Christianity, it wants to maintain the simplicity and absolute transcendence and self-sufficiency of God, but yet he still is self-diffusive and self-emptying of himself. And I think in the incarnation, that truly satisfies the mind when you contemplate these metaphysical principles, because you see God as the source of goodness, emptying himself utterly in creation through the hypostatic union, and in that way, uh, uh, I think the gap is bridged in a way that
Right.
it wasn't in Platonic in Neoplatonic systems.
Yeah, and so you were talking about Platonism too, and on the Aristotelian side too, I think natural reason can certainly establish that our final ends are in the good, in God. That
Yeah,
is, I think Saint Thomas would argue this in the Summa. See if I can pull this up. This is first part of the second part, question one. For example, articles 1 to 4, where he does establish by this is through natural reason, doesn't appeal to any sort of Christian revelation, that we know our final ends are in God, and this is through Aristotelian sort of argument through final causes. And this
yeah,
this cannot proceed ad infinitum because it's essentially ordered. There must be one such thing, and this represents God. So we know by natural reason our final ends are in God. But again, with this idea that Christianity adds something to natural reason, which we cannot get on
yeah.
its own.
Christianity tells us how to get there, essentially.
Right.
Because Christianity, what it does is it, uh, if we recognize that our final end is in God, well, then we come to the position, we have to face the question, well, how do I get there? If I'm a finite creature, how can I traverse that infinite gap? I haven't seen anyone just be subsumed into the divine essence. So, what is how do I achieve this union with God intellectually and through my will? Well, Christianity provides the answer that it's through incorporation into the mystical body of the incarnate God. And so you have this divine, you have this system where the divine condescends to the level of the creature to raise the creature up back to himself. You have that beautiful line from Saint Athanasius that um, God became man so that man might become God, and that perfectly fulfills what has been found wanting in natural reason. Natural reason can say, okay, we can establish the existence of God. We can know that there's this compatibility between the intellect and the divine, such that the uh, intentionality of the intellect and the will is to unite itself to the divine as the first cause and as the ultimate good. Uh, but I don't have the equipment, the natural equipment to get there on my own, and 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 yet we still have that inclination toward it, and so Christianity gives us a perfect mechanism by which that can be made possible.
Right.
And it
And
would be
then,
kind of odd. It would be kind of awkward intellectually if that mechanism wasn't there. You know?
right. Yeah, and that leads into the main argument of your video for your argument
Yeah,
for Christianity, and that the the diffusiveness of God leads naturally by plausibility, not by deduction, but by plausibility into the doctrine of the incarnation. And as we learn from John 1, that the Word becomes flesh,
yeah,
and that provides the concrete means for achieving our final ends. So it's not just some abstraction. I mean, this is kind of a thought that I had that when I was in my Platonic phase that made Christianity. I suspect this is why Christianity it's very attractive for a Platonist, that the
Yes,
abstract becomes concrete in Christianity. The word becomes flesh.
right, right. It shows how the it shows how the good can diffuse itself into creation uh, without the good being lost in creation, as say like a process theologian would have it, where God creates the world and then kind of gets lost in it. No, we can maintain the transcendence, the transcendence of God. We can maintain the perfection, the absolute perfection of God, the impassibility of God, and yet uh, still have a means by which God can uh, outpour Himself uh, onto created being, which has a relation to Him by virtue of participating in the divine goodness through its existence. But it can have that intimate union with God through uh, through the hypostatic union of, of of Christ, where God
Right.
unites Himself to a human nature.
Yeah, and as you were saying with that quote by Saint Athanasius, that God becomes man so that man might become little g gods, right? But I suspect this is something that, I mean, I think we have this in Catholicism too, but this is something especially emphasized by the Orthodox in
Yeah.
their idea of theosis.
It's
Right.
particularly interesting that if you start with those philosophical premises that it makes sense for uh, God to provide a means by which we can attain unity with Him uh, through, you know, this mediator of Christ. Uh, I think it's the sacramental uh, denominations of Christianity that make the most sense out of that. Um, because if you're just a Protestant, then how can you how can you link yourself ontologically to Christ if He uh, is no longer with us? Uh, if His human nature is no longer with us, I think Catholicism, and I guess Orthodoxy has it too, um, provides that means by which uh, we incorporate ourselves into the mystical body through the sacramental life of the Church, and that ontologically connects us to that unification of humanity and divinity that was made a reality in the incarnation. It's the same incarnate Christ that we unite ourselves to ontologically through the sacraments.
Yeah, that's actually what I was just about to mention with the sacraments too. In that it also provides a continuing visible reflection of God's invisible workings. I mean,
Yes.
as we understand the sacraments, for example, the Eucharist, in that
Mm-hmm.
we, as Catholics, we believe that Christ is really present in the sacrament. I mean, that's a continuing sign of God's invisible workings, right? His invisible grace. And also in other sacraments too, not just the Eucharist too, also say in uh, confession, where one tries to expiate themselves. Of they try to get rid of all the junk, try to uproot
Yeah.
as many vices as they can so that they may become more Christ-like.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Okay. I think. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, I think that was pretty much it for chapter 4. Actually, there was one more thing because I mean, he talks some smack about positivism. I can't
We
resist
can't resist
calling him
that. Yeah.
solo. Yeah. So this is paragraph 46. He says, opposed to this kind of thinking were various forms of atheistic humanism,
Mm.
expressed in philosophical terms, which regarded faith as alienating and damaging to the development of a full rationality. They did not hesitate to present
Tips
themselves as new
Fedora.
religions. They did not hesitate to present themselves as new religions, serving as a basis for projects which, on the political and social plane, gave rise to totalitarian systems which have been disastrous for humanity. I think what he's referring to is some of the early positivistic, like religions of humanity, like Comte. I think that
Yeah.
system was explicitly a religion, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like Comte with his the doctrine of positivism. Yeah, religion of humanity. I mean, some of the early positivism that was. I mean, as I said, that was explicitly religious. It was supposed to be a sort of replacement for things like Christianity. And then
Yeah.
he goes on to say in this paragraph, the result of the crisis of rationalism. What has appeared finally is nihilism. As a philosophy of nothingness, it has a certain attraction for people of our time. Its adherents claim that the surge is an end in itself, as we were saying before, right? The surge is
Mhm.
an end in itself, without any hope or possibility of ever attaining the goal of truth. In the nihilist interpretation, life is no more than an occasion for sensations and experiences in which the ephemeral has pride of place. I'm kind of reminded in that of if you've read Brave New World,
Yeah,
the
yeah, I have.
feelies, yeah, the feelies, where they go in, it's just like pure titillation. They have like these magnetic. They go into like a movie theater sort of place and they watch basically some porn and they
Right.
go in. It's just like pure titillation. They're just the sheer hedonism. I'm kind of reminded that of uh, by this paragraph here.
Yeah, at the end, that's definitely what I get from it too.
Yeah, he talks a little
And
smack about
that's definitely present in our society, obviously in droves.
yeah, but this general thought, as we were saying before, that this simultaneous worshipping. I mean, this isn't all people, but this worshipping of science on the one hand, but also a mistrust in the efficacy of our intellect to actually reach truth, and that we only concentrate on the search for truth, but we don't actually think we can get there.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because a lot of these atheists, they almost have religious reverence for reason, and yet when you or and I launch an argument, uh, strictly from reason, but it arrives at a conclusion that they don't like, oh, then they just go into like uh, radical Cartesian skepticism, where they go like, oh, then I guess reason doesn't actually get us anywhere after all, simply by itself.
Yeah, if reason reaches a conclusion that I don't like, by modus tollens, I mean, reason can't work, right?
Yeah, and
Because
but then
I somehow
they
know that the conclusion that you've reached is wrong, right?
yeah, that's at least the impression I get.
Right. So, any more comments on that chapter?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's pretty good for that one.
Right. So, chapter five, entitled "The Magisterium's Interventions in Philosophical Matters."
Right.
Well, perhaps for the audience, we could just say what the magisterium means, because
Yeah, the
that's not a
magisterium
word
is
that's probably
essentially the magistra, of course, means teacher teaching. Um, and it's essentially the teaching office of the Catholic Church by which its doctrines and dogmas are defined uh, and listed and expounded upon uh, in order to give the church and give the church's teachings uh, definition and clarity and intelligibility.
right. Yeah. So, the general impression I got from this chapter was, yeah, as JP2 saying that the magisterium must speak on these philosophical systems which can come into contradiction with Christianity.
Yeah.
And it must also correct some of the profound errors within modern philosophy. And there are a number of systems that he mentions, one of them being phenomenism and immanentism, that he says that the magisterium must correct it must admonish, but also learn sufficiently well that they understand why it's wrong, not just ignore,
Yeah,
but also learn it well. I think that's what he says in one of these
I
paragraphs, that
think
you learn the system well.
that is one thing I think that um, the church needed to get a little bit better at, um, which is really taking in these pernicious systems, these erroneous systems, but really seeking to understand them from within, and in so doing, um, discern a better approach as to how to refute them and explain why why fundamentally they are incompatible with the truth of the Christian faith.
Yeah, and just we were talking before. There was one point on this that you disagreed on. I think it was paragraph 49. Let me just read this just to
Yeah.
make what JP2 is saying here clear. Quote, the church has no philosophy of her own, nor does she canonize any one particular philosophy in preference to others. The underlying reason for this reluctance is that even when it engages theology, philosophy must remain faithful to its own principles and methods. Otherwise, there would be no guarantee that it would remain oriented to truth and that it was moving towards truth by way of a process governed by reason. A philosophy which did not proceed in the light of reason according to its own principles and methods would serve little purpose. At the deepest level, the autonomy which philosophy enjoys is rooted in the fact that reason is by its nature oriented to truth and is equipped, moreover, with the means necessary to arrive at truth. A philosophy conscious of this as its constitutive status cannot but respect the demands and the data of revealed truth. Yet history shows that philosophy, especially modern philosophy, has taken wrong turns and fallen into error. It is neither the task nor the competence of the magisterium to intervene in order to make good the lacunas of deficient philosophical discourse. Rather, it is the magisterium's duty to respond clearly and strongly when controversial philosophical opinions threaten right understanding of what has been revealed, and when false and partial theories, which sow the seed of serious error, confusing the pure and simple faith of the people of God, begin to spread more widely.
Yeah, I don't take too much issue with what's said there. I would just say that um, I think it is while the church has not, you know, formally undergone any canonization process of a particular philosophical school, uh, I think it can be pretty definitively held that the church does have a uh, a strong sense of, for example, philosophical realism within her own internal structure. You know, um, you can't. Uh, Certain doctrines of the church are, strictly speaking, unintelligible apart from philosophical consideration, such as transubstantiation. You cannot understand transubstantiation without conceding a realism about universals. You just can't. It won't work, and it would make
Or,
transubstantiation completely unintelligible.
or
It
that
wouldn't
there are
make
no
sense.
substances.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, or even that, the mind is somehow incapable of uh, recognizing, the underlying noumena of phenomena. I think that is also something that the church takes for granted. The church presupposes. The church, it's built in to the basic intellectual furniture of Catholic thinking, that uh, certain uh, certain philosophical categories that have that don't belong exclusively per se to any particular school of philosophy, but have been given to us through specific philosophical schools, such as Platonism, Aristotelianism, Thomism, and not uh, Kantianism or Cartesianism, Humeanism. Uh, there is a sense in which the former has priority over the latter in 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 the church's thinking.
Right. Yeah. This sort of actually, let me go back to paragraph 44 because we were just talking there about how
Yeah,
I mean there are certain ideas which are I mean they make Christian doctrine totally unintelligible. I think one of those that's actually point out here is realism. And
yeah,
that if you take an anti-realist approach, I mean a lot of Christianity just doesn't make any sense. Or
yeah,
if you say
yeah.
there are no
Exactly.
essences, there are no
Right.
substances, or there are no essences, how do you make sense of transubstantiation if there are no essences?
Yeah, I mean it's partly why Pius IX explicitly condemned this as an error. He said, let's see, let me get it here. Yeah, he says this is an error he's condemning, that the church not only ought never to pass judgment on philosophy, but ought to tolerate the errors of philosophy, leaving it to correct itself. Uh, that's something that Pius IX understood as uh, simply opposed to uh, the church's fundamental way of understanding the truth that she has been entrusted to protect.
Yeah. Another radical example of of a philosophy that's totally incompatible, I think, with Christianity is solipsism. We were just saying that earlier.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Or,
that's
and
true.
any sort of like
Uh,
materialism or like hard determinism, which undercuts free will. Because I mean, what
yeah.
sense does sin make if there's no free will?
Or even,
If you can't,
it's yeah, even more subtle things like a denial of final causality, for example. You can't understand Catholic moral theology if you deny final causality. Uh, if you deny, and also, if you reject certain classical or traditional uh, philosophical categories, then oftentimes you might not be led explicitly to a heresy, but it will give you the tools to kind of undermine orthodoxy. Um, for example, if you deny uh, immanent finality, the idea that we have various inclinations that derive from our nature, uh, ontologically speaking, um, as human beings, uh, then you can use that as a way to, for example, undermine the church's sexual teaching very
yeah,
easily. Because you could easily just say that, okay, well, uh, why? Okay, well, you could say that procreation is one way of exercising uh, the reproductive faculty, but who's to say that that is somehow intrinsic um, to uh, to ethics? One could easily just say that, oh well, I could just I understand that if I use it in this procreative way, it will have a procreative effect. But who's to say that that's sort of somehow intrinsic to the basic integrity of the faculty? Well, that's a philosophical issue to be sure, but it's something that, depending on how you fall on that question, will lead you to either be more closer to orthodoxy or to heterodoxy or even heresy. We would have to be very much keenly aware of that.
and yeah, yeah. Well, let me read one paragraph 44. Go kind of logs Thomas as a model of theology. He says, profoundly that whatever of the Holy Spirit, Roma quoquam sancto est, Saint Thomas, in him the church's magisterium recognized passion for truth, heights unthinkable, for truly to truth, the real could activity of truth and produce not merely a philosophy of quote what seems to be unquote, but a philosophy of what is.
Yes.
And
So
there, perhaps we can talk some smack about phenomenalism.
right. I mean, uh, right there. I mean, it's a perfect example of that. That a realist philosophy is definitely preferred in the church over a more phenomenological approach that would try to put up barriers between the knowing subject and the object of knowledge.
Right. Yeah, and this is I think alongside Immanentism and agnosticism, which were also condemned by uh, Pius X and Passion Domi, that well, obviously things like Marxism and atheistic communism are also going to be totally incompatible with
Yeah,
Catholicism. And also some more subtle
right.
systems too, like existentialism, historicism, and some forms of evolutionary theory, which he cites Humani
Yeah,
Generis.
do you think you might want to talk a little
And
bit about that because
yeah,
that's something that a lot of people have hang-ups over, which is the evolution issue.
you think Humani Generis was encyclical dealing with that?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit.
What was the main document, Humani Generis,
Yeah, that was Pius the
with
12th wrote that.
evolution?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually have it here in my book.
Yeah, if I remember, there are of course some we accept as Catholics, such as the creation of the human soul. Um, but at the same time, there are aspects of evolution that aren't in contradiction with the Catholic
Right.
faith. So
And it's
you're free
interesting.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting how, in a sense, I'm baffled by how one could accept the evolutionary theory without certain philosophical categories that St. Thomas Aquinas can give you. For example, the principle of proportionate causality. It seems to me that if you don't have the principle of proportionate causality, that the which states that the effect is in some way in the cause, um, then I don't see how evolution can get off the ground without violating, the maxim that non-being cannot arise from being in some way. Uh, if you have uh, new species simply emerging from their causal antecedents without without conceding that the effect is in some way in the cause, either formally or eminently, uh, it's very difficult to, I think, rationally uh, accept evolutionary theory. So it's just interesting how we can actually use the we can use the philosophy from our own tradition at the benefit of the evolutionist, who I think could benefit from uh, certain philosophical categories that we have at our disposal, and then um, you know,
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to certain scientific theories, a couple of examples would be like Darwin's theory of evolution. Not even Darwin's conception of it, even the um, modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, or even of say quantum mechanics. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the things that the scientific theories say are by no means obvious as to what they mean for actual reality, like what the actual claims even are.
right.
And a lot of these theories are at the metaphysical level. The metaphysical level understanding it's not. A lot of these theories are just a total mess. I mean, I happen to think evolutionary theory is one of them. Quantum mechanics is certainly a
Yeah,
mess. So a lot
it's
of relativity theory is a mess. I
it,
mean,
yeah, it is. I mean, haven't they not made even very much progress as far as theoretical quantum mechanics is concerned in the past, like, I don't know how long it is. Um, there's a reason why they keep hitting these walls. I mean, they can keep using their mathematical models, and they can keep achieving mathematical accuracy based on the predictions um, that their that their mathematical means of measurement can give them. Uh, but what it means qualitatively is something that they often don't comment very much on. Uh, and I think it would be very much helped with a uh, a synthesis, where we could synthesize the data together with that more qualitative philosophy um, that I think is perfected through the metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas. And interestingly enough, this is actually happening right now. If you look at one of quite a few physicists, there's Stephen Barr, who's working on this. There's Wolfgang Smith, who wrote a book on how he thinks that Thomistic ontology can help uh, understand better on a qualitative level the quantitative findings of quantum mechanics, and that has been very interesting to me. So it is very interesting uh, how this is one sort of instantiation of how uh, I'll use the word faith. Of course, Thomistic metaphysics, you arrive at it through reason, but it is very much uh, uh, uniquely compatible with the faith in a way other schools of philosophy are not. In a way, this philosophy that is enshrined in the faith can actually help at the benefit of these more rationalistic ways of approaching science that you get in quantum mechanics that ironically, uh, if you take them, uh, if you read their quantitative analyses and interpret them qualitatively, you actually get something that is very much opposed to the basic rational categories that we're used to in everyday experience, right? I mean, if you interpret quantum mechanics, the quantitative data in quantum mechanics, and try to interpret it in everyday life, it's going to come out very anti-commonsensical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, a lot of people don't realize this until they either study the theories in question in more detail
Yeah.
or they read into the philosophy of those theories. For example, the philosophy of quantum mechanics or philosophy of relativity or philosophy of biology. I
But I
mean,
mean, wasn't it Heisenberg himself who was very much, uh, to an extent at least, perhaps friendly toward uh, the Aristotelian doctrine of active potency and as using it as a lens through which we can understand the mysterious activities of electrons?
I think so. I think he drew a loose analogy between superposition
Potency, right?
and potency. Yeah, between
Yeah.
and that and the superposition that
And that's
a
something
state
that
might find itself.
Wolfgang Smith expounds upon a lot in his books, and it's very fascinating how you can really get at Thomistic, hylomorphism, the distinction between matter and form, and use that as a lens through which we can qualitatively interpret certain elements of the quantitative data that you get from quantum mechanics. It's just very, very interesting. It's a good way of verifying, in a way, how reason and faith can really come together in a mutually helpful, symbiotic way.
Yeah, if you just take the example of quantum mechanics, it's by no means resolved what that theory even says. I think the latest poll, if I remember correctly, is that I'm not even sure if it's the majority of physicists, but the plurality of physicists subscribe to the Copenhagen interpretation. But it's, I think I heard someone else say that most thinking physicists or most philosophers of physics they reject the Copenhagen. They think it's stupid,
Yeah,
even though that's I mean, when I had quantum chemistry in college, but the Copenhagen is the one you often learn. But as I said, a lot of philosophers of physics who are very reflective upon the subject, they think it's false. The Copenhagen is false,
hmm,
but it's by no means clear from the mathematics itself. This is something people also don't get from the mathematics itself what these theories even mean. I
right.
mean,
Yeah,
really, when someone appeals to a certain interpretation and they say, "Well, the theory just tells us this," what they're doing is just appealing to an authority. They heard someone say it somewhere, and they think that this is the resolved interpretation of that theory in question.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's all. It's a very interesting side discussion, like what some of these theories, which I think they're a mess at the metaphysical level, what these even say.
right.
But going back to AP2 here. So on this topic of the general confusion of modern philosophy, he warns in paragraph 52 against rebounding with fideism and what he calls radical traditionalism. I'm not quite sure what he's talking about with that one, but he's warning against rebounding um, to the opposite extreme where we deny that reason has any efficacy at all, and we shouldn't retreat into something like fideism, which he doesn't have nice things to say about here.
Right. In North City.
Right, and he emphasizes that in Vatican I, this fideism is pretty much anathematized. Is that the right word to say?
Yeah, yeah, it's uh solemnly anathematized, yes. And for good reason. I mean,
Right.
because if you take a fideistic approach, which a lot of Protestants tend to do, not all, of course, obviously, but a lot of them do, um, I think that is actually a very much a I think it serves as the handmaiden to atheism because it emboldens atheists. Because fideism is a very rationally speaking untenable position to take, and when you have Protestants and other Christians try to push for it, it lends credence to what the atheists say, and I think rightly. Uh, if fideism were true, it would be uh, would not reflect well on Christianity, because it would be reduced then to emotional sentiment.
Right. Yeah. Among the systems of thought he condemns here, he says fideism, radical traditionalism, rationalism, which I take him to mean this idea that unless we can work through it by the light of natural reason, like on our own steam, then we shouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
Not so much in like the distinction between rationalism and empiricism, but perhaps there's a connection there too. Um, let's see. Yeah, and he reemphasized that in the First Vatican Council, Dei Filius Dis was pronounced very solemnly against. And that faith is supra. It's adds something above reason, but it is not contrary to reason, and we don't natural reason. We don't just throw out of those two categories, faith and reason. We don't just throw out reason and just rest in faith.
Yeah.
I think there is one portion here. He also talked a bit about, because we're talking about some of the Protestant ideas, and he talks about 55 about biblicism. And let me see if I can read that, because this is going to introduce a division that you see within Christianity too. Let's see. This is from paragraph 55. He says, there are also signs of a resurgence of fideism, which fails to recognize the importance of rational knowledge and philosophical discourse for the understanding of faith, indeed for the very possibility of belief in God. One currently widespread symptom of this fideistic tendency is a biblicism, which tends to make the reading and exegesis of sacred scripture the sole criterion of truth. In consequence, the Word of God is identified with sacred scripture alone, thus eliminating the doctrine of the Church, which the Second Vatican Council stressed quite specifically. Having recalled that the Word of God is present in both scripture and tradition, the Council continues emphatically, quote, sacred tradition comprises a single sacred deposit of the Word of God. Embracing this deposit and united with their pastors, the people of God remain always faithful to the teaching of the apostles. Scripture, therefore, is not the Church's sole point of reference. The supreme derives from the unity which the Spirit has created between sacred tradition, sacred scripture,
Hello?
and
You
a
cut out.
reciprocity.
Okay.
Oh, which part did you get?
Oh, I think I got it now. Okay.
Oh.
Wait, did
So
you ask
that
something?
paragraph there?
Okay.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, our connection is good, but it's okay.
Oh yeah, this is just 55 for the audience if they want to read. For Catholics, criterion of truth. Still there?
Yeah, okay, I got you now.
Right.
Okay, yeah, our connection doesn't seem to be very well, very good, rather, at the moment.
Did you get that with 55 or?
Yeah, I've been looking at 55. Even though I couldn't really hear you, I've been looking at it.
Right. So he says that, yeah, again,
okay, that's better.
It's the unity of sacred tradition, sacred scripture, and the magisterium of the Church, which is the authority for Catholics. Whereas in the beginning of that paragraph, he says that this biblicism, which tends to make the reading and exegesis of sacred scripture the sole criterion of truth, is
right.
Of this.
Right. So I think
yeah. So any comments on that? Or?
I don't think so. I think we could go on to chapter 6, though.
Sure. Yeah. So this is the interaction between philosophy and theology.
Mm.
And let's see. So what do you think of this section? Because I think there were some pretty important points in this section as well. He understands theology.
I like what he says here about moral theology, where he says that moral theology has perhaps an even greater unit of philosophy's contribution. And I think that's very true because it's very interesting that if you take like a very subtle philosophical idea, take for example that the is-ought gap, for example, that has overwhelmingly crucial implications for Catholic moral theology. Catholic moral theology is very much, I think, dependent upon the is-ought gap not being legitimate. Because if you have the is-ought gap, then the whole conception of natural law and understanding right and wrong as derivative of man's ontological nature kind of goes out the window. I think, and that whole is-ought gap debate is thoroughly couched within the realm of philosophy, and so I think the church does well to make use of kind of Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy in order to afford us with a comprehensive notion of the good from reason, in order to help us understand why she takes certain stances on moral theology. I mean, because I think this loss of, or rather, I think the emergence of the is-ought gap has really helped to dismantle the church's sexual teaching. Because a lot of people might look at the church's teaching like, why are you so hung up on what the reproductive organs do, for example? That's just how they are. It doesn't tell us how we should use them. Whereas the church understands that goodness and being are ultimately convertible. They are ultimately one and the same, particularly in God, and that what our natural inclinations reveal to us as to their ontological status, it tells us precisely what they ought to be used for. The ought derives, it flows from the is. And if you don't have that, then it's very difficult to advance in Catholic moral theology.
Right. Yeah, that's one important issue. I think that Catholics should be more aware of, like the is-ought gap and its relation to natural law. Yeah, that's one important issue that's come up nowadays with the church's sexual teachings. Mostly because we live in the post-sexual revolution age where
right,
and people are they're pretty hedonistic too. So with that particular function, it's all about pleasure. It's nothing to do with the natural ends, which are child rearing, becoming a father and a mother.
See, it's the problem because I think a lot of our apologists don't use that argument very much anymore. They often will try to say, "Oh, well, birth control leads to higher risks of cancer." And it's like, okay, that might be true, but does that really get to the fundamental reason as to why it's wrong? Not really. You really have to have recourse to these deeper philosophical arguments that we used to have, and we just haven't been using them as much as we should. You can't win the argument by just appealing to certain negative consequences that might emerge from promiscuous activity, because there could always be exceptions at that point.
You're thoroughly committed to hedonism. I'm sure many hedonists would gladly trade that
yeah, exactly.
risk of cancer and using birth control.
Right, exactly. I mean, you have risk of getting a fatal infection by I don't know, taking the subway. It's not really going to necessarily prevent me from taking the subway.
Yeah, I mean, something could happen. You can slip out and fall in front of the train.
Yeah, I mean, we you know what people do on subways and the inner cities. I mean, it's not very pleasant. So, this is an example.
But one thing I like about this section too is, again, we have this harmony between Christian teaching and philosophy. He talks a bit about some of the other philosophical traditions, such as Indian philosophy. A lot of Westerners are interested in like Indian philosophy, like Buddhism and all of that, just because it's kind of exotic.
Yeah.
He does recognize that it's a very interesting philosophical system, but at the same time, there's a universality of truth that
Yes.
it's different, but it's we still accept that there's a universality of truth, and because we accept Christianity as true, that's true for everyone.
Yes.
So you can make use of that system to kind of explain it as again going back to like Platonism and Aristotelianism, there's kind of like
Yeah.
a completion of that system. Like they recognize they recognize the appetite that they have, but what
Right.
Christianity can do is it represents the
It,
completion of that.
yeah, it may be helpful. I'm sure I'm sure that, Thomas the Apostle, when he went to evangelize uh in I'm pretty sure he went to India, right? Uh Thomas the Apostle. Um I'm pretty sure he probably made use of some of their metaphysical lexicon in order to communicate the truth of the Christian faith. Uh, that can definitely legitimately be done, but you do have to make sure though that you aren't falling into the trap of you know, relativism, where you simply see these different philosophical systems of just what's that stupid analogy that a lot of these people try to use of oh well, one philosophy or one religion gets you out one side of the elephant, and another just gets you out a different side of the elephant, but it's still the same elephant. No, you can't fall into that inanity. But at the same time, you can recognize that uh, different philosophical schools will often communicate the same truth, but with different language, different lexicon, a uh, different prioritizations. So it's just, but you have to be careful with sifting through all of that, so that you don't put ecumenism before truth.
Right. You recognize that there might be some truth in these systems to a limited degree, and they might be using different terms to refer to the same ideas. Like, I actually don't, well, I'll take David Bentley Hart when he says that like the Hindu Kama is kind of similar to the absolute,
Oh, there are
that
definitely a lot of
they too recognize that
similarities.
there is a God.
And I think
Right.
Hinduism is very incarnational, but it's a mess. You know,
Mhm.
uh, it's a mess in my opinion. The incarnational dimension of Hinduism is a mess. It doesn't have that rational clarity. It doesn't have that clarity. It doesn't have that philosophical accuracy that the incarnational dimension of Christianity has. But there's a truth to Hinduism in that it recognizes that we should recognize that the divine has an interest in diffusing itself in the created order, uh, but in a way that makes sense, in a way that we can understand rationally, intelligibly. I think Christianity perfects what is good in Hinduism, but calls Hinduism to yield to uh, the perfection for which it yearns.
Make sure that's not yielding to Hinduism, but recognizing if there's any good in Hinduism to yank that from it and make it Christianity. Just as we were saying before, not everything in Platonism and Aristotelianism can just be yielded to by Christian, because there are clear doctrines which are incompatible.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you do something like what St. Thomas does. You take the good from these things and
Yeah.
you synthesize what is correct.
Yes.
I
So
think he has a quote too that no man is totally devoid of truth too. So even if the system's totally well, the system can't be totally false, but there
right.
might be some degrees of truth in it.
I mean, like take even atheism. Uh, there's something about atheism that I think can be seen as admirable. And I mean it in the sense that I think a lot of atheists, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to look at the complexity of the world, and they're trying to derive from that complexity uh, some way to make sense of it. And they achieve this in their minds, in a sense, through reducing it down to simplicity. I think you see that in Lawrence Krauss's work. You see that in Richard Dawkins. You see that in atheistic evolutionary theory. There's something true about that. There's something true about the idea that complexity should yield to simplicity, and that's, I think, what you have uh, perfected in the church, the Catholic doctrine, not just the Catholic doctrine, but the rational principle of divine simplicity that I think nods to that truth, but fulfills it in a way that follows upon sound metaphysics.
Yeah, I think that's one. If there's, I mean, if there's any quote unquote truth in atheism, I think that's certainly one
Right.
aspect.
I
I
think
think
that's the
another.
only aspect, but
I was
yeah,
actually going to add one more, and that's at least my own experience with atheism.
yeah,
One often compelling reason to become an atheist is if one has had some experience with profound evil, or they see the
yes,
amount of evil in the world. But with that experience, what the atheist recognizes is something correct in that there is the good. There is a standard to which we are all held to. And they
yeah,
recognize that there is a reality to the good. The
yeah,
problem is that the atheist doesn't really follow through in the thought.
right.
He doesn't
Yeah, he
transcend
doesn't
reality of the good.
contemplate. He doesn't contemplate sufficiently on what it means for there to be good. I mean, because if you say there's goodness, then you have to be committed to the notion that there is a standard by which things can be better or worse. And if there's a standard by which things can be better or worse, perfected or imperfected, then uh, it seems to me the conclusion that there would be some transcendent source uh, for that common participated goodness. It seems to me that that would be rather inescapable. But they don't follow through on that. They want to reduce it down to, uh, I guess, evolutionary theory. They try to understand it just as a different shade of empathy. That doesn't really seem to be sufficient to me. I mean, it would explain how uh, you can see perfection and imperfection in realities that don't have empathy. There's for example, just in something impersonal like the ecosystem, there's a better and a worse way that it can operate. Uh, you know, the or the for example the water cycle. It has a functionality to it that can be understood as uh, being uh, uh, there is a sense in which you could say conceivably it could operate in a way that's better or worse, right? Um, uh, as it relates to the good of the ecosystem, for example. Um, that is something that you can conceive of goodness and evil without uh, without even entertaining the notion of simply Darwinian empathy. The point is you have to recognize they have to recognize that goodness is much more of a metaphysical reality than just some offshoot of socio-biological evolution.
Right. Yeah. I think the aspect of the good and another aspect that the atheist doesn't often they recognize true is the reality of truth. Means something
Yeah,
quite simple. And of course, as that means people were sympathetic to Thomistic thought, we recognize as being and goodness as convertible.
right. Ultimately
Right.
the
That
same.
one. Right. Yeah. They're the same. One signifies something about the other.
Yeah,
And I mean, the atheist recognizes the reality of truth because presumably thinks his own position is true, and he's just because he thinks it's really the truth. I mean,
right.
he might not understand. It may be uncomfortable, but the atheist is going to say that, well, I mean, you have to deal with it. It's the truth.
Yeah,
So in a way, he's being very pious towards the truth. But if he only reflected upon one very provocative theory of what the good and the true and what the good and the true are, for example, the good as being how well something conforms to its nature and its ultimate convertibility with truth.
Yes.
You would see that these are just both transcendentals that people like the Platonists and the Aristotelians have been talking about all along, and
Yeah,
which
exactly.
signifies divine nature.
Anyway, I do have to kind of get going at 11:30, but I think we
Okay.
covered kind of enough of the encyclical. I think that was a good way to kind of expound on some aspects of it related to what we're doing with our channels and what we're trying to get into the you know common mindset when it comes to these philosophical and the religious issues. I think it went well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the only other thing JP2 gets at the final chapter is trying to rekindle this trust in the intellect that truth. What he echoes a maxim by the scholastics, the adequation of things to intellect, the adequatio re et intellectus, trying to
Yeah.
recover this and trying to rejuvenate this system of thought from first principles.
Mhm.
And that goes into what you're especially interested in with first
Right.
principles of metaphysics, right?
Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
All right. So with that, thank you for joining us tonight. And we're to try to do this maybe weekly, this podcast, which is as of yet untitled, but hopefully I'll think of some witty name or provocative name or
Yeah.
something.
We'll brainstorm about it.
Right. All right. So thanks for joining us and have a good night.